were you surprised at the revelations of the Twitter files?
Yes, and I continue to be surprised. Just as you said, I didn't when we started this, we were a little more focused on what the companies are doing, and now we're much more concerned about, as you just said, what the government is doing. It's insidious, and it's a little in the shadows and not well known and publicized. But the government started off, as you know, focusing on using information as a weapon for overseas terrorism, and then it kind of shifted.
Hi, Ron Coleman here, and thank you, Colemanators, for joining me once again. Today, we're going to talk to a fellow named Mike Matthys. Mike is with the Institute for a Better Internet, formerly known as the First and 14th Institute, which I'm guessing has something to do with the First and 14th Amendments. There's a lot going on with internet governance, a lot changing. Congress now is trying to fiddle around with things in a way that I think is very problematic, and I can't imagine Mike doesn't have opinions about it. And he's going to talk to us about some of the approaches that he and his folks. He is a telecom and Silicon Valley veteran. He's not somebody who comes to this without some understanding of what the technology is and what the commercial and institutional issues are. So I want to welcome Mike Matthys and thank him for coming. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, thanks, Ron. Nice to meet you online. And yes, I'm out here in Silicon Valley, kind of in the heart of where a lot of this stuff is happening.
But you grew up as a real American, right? In Iowa.
That's right. In fact, our institute is made up of three co-founders, and all three of us have known each other for decades, and we're all from Iowa.
You're all from Iowa, and my producer Jeremy Core is from Iowa. So I'm feeling very flyover country today.
There you go.
but on the other hand, you've made yourself comfortable in Silicon Valley. So you're going to have to justify to us why that you're still an okay guy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when we started the Institute for a Better Internet, it was actually triggered by our local Silicon Valley representative in Congress, who is Anna Eshoo, who you may or may not know, kind of a backbencher, I guess, in Congress. And Anna and another member wrote letters to DirecTV, to Comcast, basically all the TV channel companies, and saying, hey, you highly regulated companies, why are you carrying this stuff from Fox News and Newsmax and others? And so, being
but she was criticizing them for carrying it?
She was asking them to stop carrying it, yes. Not demanding, only suggesting, as government officials do.
Right.
And so that triggered us to, instead of just complaining about it, I went around to my colleagues and friends. And as you know, we are about 45% Democrat, 20-something% Republican, and everyone else is independent. But really, independent means Democrat. And even around here, there was a very strong majority that said, that letter was wrong. And so we decided to do a professional survey of Anna Eshoo's district and Nancy Pelosi's district. And we found there very strong majorities said, government should not get involved with telling TV companies what channels to carry. It shouldn't be financially disincentivizing or incentivizing to carry certain content. So with that, we kind of launched this effort. And I have two others. One is he calls himself a blueberry floating in the Red Sea of Texas. So he's kind of similar, but opposite. And he got blocked by Facebook a few times for posting information about COVID solutions that he had read about. Yes, exactly. And he's a Lyme survivor. So he's very familiar with alternative medicine versus traditional medicine. And then Brian Jackson, the third, he has worked inside Google and Facebook for more than 15 years as a senior engineering management. And he was bothered by Amazon. So all three of us came together at the same time. That was when Amazon banned a book called When Harry Became Sally, or maybe the other way around. And you know, living here, we're very familiar with the whole LGBTQ groups of people. We have friends, but banning that book just kind of pushed him over the edge. So that was what triggered us, those three things, to form this institute and start developing, you know, some ideas around it. And we've actually come up with what we think is, you know, a workable, scalable solution.
Now, what year was this then? It wouldn't have been that long ago.
Anna Eshu's letter was February 2021. So that was about when we started it.
Okay, so and did you guys come up with the initial funding yourselves? Or
We
you
did a lot of secondary research. We were talking to the companies, did a lot of reading. We came up with some of the key parts ourselves. Some of it are pretty, I think, almost standard, you know, some ideas of transparency and things like that. But we evolved it every time we met with people. And I've met quite a number of offices on Capitol Hill. We've met some other organizations that are kind of models for what we propose. And we've been meeting with some of the key companies here, in particular, their sort of public policy and content moderation groups.
so how would you compare your organization to EFF, the Electronic Freedom Foundation, who you know, all things being equal, they're older, but it sounds like they're interested in the same issues, although I think their perspective might not be yours.
Yeah, I think their perspective is different. And I'm not intimately familiar with them. A long time ago, I was involved in the privacy battle, where companies were facing the potential heavy-handed regulation of the government that was going to force some kind of privacy policy. And the Electronic Frontier of the Future was very deeply involved in that. They, you know, it was very interesting to me and educational that the companies actually decided to come up with a self-regulated privacy policy, primarily out of fear that the government was going to completely screw things up with a government mandate that would have created a problem. But this whole opt-in, opt-out, if you're familiar with that, you know, terminology for privacy and advertising. So at the end of the day, they created privacy policy, mainly, you know, transparency, if you will, to put it out there so people can read about it. Nobody reads it, of course. Nobody reads their EULA or terms of service. They just click to get their service. But so I think we're different because we're focused on the issue in a different way. We're not just focused on one aspect of content moderation, but we're trying to be nonpartisan or bipartisan and looking at what could be something acceptable to, if you will, both sides of the political aisle.
So before we get to the TikTok and the restrict bills, which I'm sure that you have something to say about, I mean, obviously, it's come to your attention that we're living in a system now where the government has insinuated itself very, very deeply into the content moderation process at the major social media platforms. Were you surprised at the revelations of the Twitter files?
Yes, and I continue to be surprised. You know, I just as you said, I didn't, when we started this, we were a little more focused on what the companies are doing, and now we're much more concerned about, as you just said, what the government is doing. It's insidious, and it's a little you know, in the shadows and not well known and publicized. But you know, the government started off, as you know, focusing on using information as a weapon for overseas terrorism. And then it kind of shifted because of two things. Trump got elected and Brexit happened. And so then there was a remarkable confluence, I think, of some of the government agencies worried about information and terrorism with CIA, DHS, FBI, kind of found a marriage partner with the Democratic party who was so concerned about Trump getting elected. And so they've kind of together, enabled this government intrusion in content moderation, both in terms of people coming from the government to work in these companies, but especially the government influencing and promoting content moderation policies that fit the government narrative. And even to the point where we've learned now they're not so much worried about just disinformation and misinformation, but something that has been called malinformation, where it's true information, but it's somehow inconvenient, to the government.
See, I'll tell you, I actually thought that that's what misinformation was. I know that disinformation was a form of propaganda. And I actually wrote a while ago that misinformation seemed to be a what we call a back mutation. In other words, I don't think there was such a word as misinformation until recently. I think a person could be misinformed, but misinformation, I think, was meant as a way to make people who spread information that may not be entirely accurate or may be mistaken or may be inconvenient sound like disinformation, but not quite accuse them of being involved in disinformation, which is a very affirmative form of propaganda. Now you're saying that there's a new terminology, which I had not heard before just now, called and who's using that terminology? Is that the IC?
It came out in Michael Schellenberger's testimony to Congress when he was talking about the censorship industrial complex. And I think you're correct. So disinformation is if I say something knowingly false. And misinformation is I say something false, but I didn't know it was false. It was a mistake. But this other category is it's true information. For example, the COVID vaccine doesn't necessarily prevent you from transmitting and getting COVID. It might have other benefits, but preventing the information that it doesn't transmit, the virus, that's malinformation. They know it's true, but they want to stop it anyway because they're concerned about vaccine hesitancy, or it's just inconvenient to the government's program or narrative.
So you obviously watched Michael Schellenberg's testimony or heard it, or at least parts of it. How is it possible to remain nonpartisan in an environment where one political party seems to be extremely comfortable with these developments, and that's the Democratic Party? How do you guys squaring the circle there?
It's very interesting, but particularly because John and Brian, my co-founders, are very active in Democratic campaigns and political campaigns and elections. So they just feel like, this is very important for our culture and for our country. And we have to, if we present ourselves as right-wing partisan, that will make it more difficult.
Right.
We're not going to get anywhere. Exactly. So I think we present to the middle and say, look, there are bad things that happen with false information. However, as the Supreme Court has said several times, those harms from false information are tiny compared to the massive harm of the government trying to tell us what's true and what's false, because that is absolutely the path to 1984, the path to authoritarianism. And so we believe that. I think we're also willing to grant some content does need to be moderated. There is some safety issue, so we don't advocate the Wild West. And I believe even Elon Musk does not advocate the Wild West either. He's saying there are certain types of content that should be moderated, meaning blocked. Some users should be banned, but we shouldn't be doing it based on viewpoint, and we shouldn't be doing it based on the government telling us what's true and what's false.
Do you think that the public agrees with that sort of down the middle statement of the issue that you just described?
It's very interesting. I get excellent response from Republican offices on Capitol Hill. Very helpful. It's been really difficult to get response from the Democratic side. And I think it's partly because the more progressive far left wing, and both parties have their far out, wings, but the far left wing is, as you say, very comfortable. They like the idea of controlling information to their benefit. In fact, I would even say when we started, and even to this day, we've kind of decided the companies themselves really didn't sign up for this job. Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, yes, they're dominated by liberal employees, but they didn't sign up to be the arbiters of what's true and false, because no matter what they decide, they're trying to serve a large population of users. If they're picking true and false, they will piss off whichever side they deem to be, untrue or wrong. So they're looking for an entity or someone to help them get out of this dilemma. However, the government is not the answer, as some people say, because the government, as we just mentioned, picking what's true and false or what to be moderated, that goes against our free speech rights in our Constitution.
I have been struck by the amount of times in the Twitter files documents that Yoel Roth, who is hard to paint as a hero here, and yet Yoel Roth pushes back both against the government, but also against more radical points of view in Twitter over the years. I found that extraordinary.
I have a very similar story, which is talking to a very senior executive at Google, who I don't want to name, but he said, Mike, we get a literal fire hydrant torrent of requests from the left to censor people, to demonetize YouTube sites, to do this. We get a trickle from the right. And there's the right sort of tends to believe in more freedom and, let be what be. But he says, we struggle, we try to lean to the right, but inevitably, they sort of recognize just dealing with that torrent as same as Yoel Roth, you end up feeling pressure like, well, if I accept some of these requests, I'm still leaning to the right, but now I'm accepting some of these requests. And he did point out things that were ridiculous, like the Hamilton 68 identifying a bunch of American Twitter users as Russian bots. I mean, he identified things like that, but either he was overruled or he decided to go with the flow of letting the government kind of influence their content moderation. So I agree, he did some good things, but it's hard to call him a hero at the end of the day.
But let me rephrase my earlier question, because I understand that to a large extent you're talking to people in leadership positions, in various branches of government. I presume both executive and legislative, not judicial. If it's judicial, I'd certainly like to know that. But my question is, what do you because there has been this partisan distinction in receptiveness to what can only be called government censorship, do you think that has affected the way non-leader, in other words, the 250 million people, the 300 million people in this country who are not children and who are not elites, but are regular Americans who don't really have the greatest concern about privacy, for example. I think that's more of a European obsession, but who do assume that they can say what they want. But I have my impression, as someone who's very involved as a user of social media, is that a lot of people on the left, and I just mean regular users, have taken a cue from the leadership of the Democratic Party and said, yeah, this is the right, heavy-handed content moderation and government involvement in restricting hate speech, even, not only just bad, misinformation or malinformation, but feelings protection is fine. Do you agree with me that has become,
Yeah, I'm very worried about that. And I think it comes from our education system. There's so many examples. I think it's now seems like it's the majority of university campuses are teaching our kids that some speech is so harmful and scary that it should be censored. So the whole idea of for example, Skokie, Illinois, right? That, hey, this is terrible, it's awful, but it's their freedom of speech to let these terrible people have their march through the middle of Skokie, Illinois. So I do worry about it a lot, and I think it's important to, and we need to do more of this ourselves, but not only talk to the leadership, but we have to get the message out that says, for the government to start censoring based on what's convenient to the government is not a good thing. And we have to engage that discussion, because there's a lot of very persuasive people out there talking about how censorship is good, and censorship, it makes things better and safer. And I think that is just completely incorrect.
Well, you use the word safer. There has been a very purposeful disinformation campaign that has been undertaken over the last decades of associating words that hurt people's feelings with violence.
Yeah, that's right.
Or with a reduction in safety. And everyone understands that hateful words can lead to hateful actions. But the premise of the First Amendment was, short of, hey, wow, look, there's an Irishman, let's beat him up, which is a very, very direct and clear and immediate call to violence, that pretty much anything else that people say should be tolerated. Now, on the other hand, historically, it hasn't always been tolerated. And certainly before the incorporation of the 14th Amendment to the states, many states had very active anti-sedition laws. And of course, Eugene V. Debs, during wartime, there's been a lot less tolerance for dissent. But, it's very ironic, because the Supreme Court has really come so far and continues to be almost in an absolutist vein when it comes to free speech. But it doesn't seem that any other institutions have followed them. I mean, we talk about political leaders and we talk about the general population. There was a time when you could count on major media and academic organizations, and you've already addressed the academic point. The newspapers, they're fine, because they're not in danger from government censorship anymore. They see the enemy as the right, and Donald Trump and whatever forces of dissent he unleashes.
Right. Well, the mainstream media has kind of benefited from this. For example, Google made a very consequential decision in about 2018, where they changed some of their content moderation policies, particularly for YouTube, and said, we are going to rely on, air quotes, authoritative sources. Now, what they ended up doing is relying for COVID on the WHO. They literally rely on authoritative websites, and they've designated those as sort of being long-standing media. So they trust the New York Times, they trust the Washington Post, they trust these kind of CNN. But younger, newer, typically right-wing media are by definition, according to Google, not authoritative sources, and can be discounted. And there's just So I think the media goes along with it, and I think the media has just changed, and partly it's because the media has become so fragmented, where instead of having Walter Cronkite in two or three newspapers having a business just telling us what's going on from the center point of view, really reporting news and being journalists. Now, they're fighting over audience by moving further and further away from the center and toward getting clicks and views and things from the far right or from the far left. And so now you even see very institutionalists like the New York Times has just moved so far to the left that any, reasonable thinking person can recognize that the New York Times has lost its credibility and has become a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party or for certain government narratives. It's very interesting when you put the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on your breakfast table and look at the same story. And it's like Venus and Mars. They're just so journalism has just fundamentally changed.
So I understand that you at the IBI have formulated an approach, something not just let's talk about this, not let's worry about this, but here's what we think is the way forward. Can you just, am I correct? Am I informed correctly?
Yes. So we think that
by an authoritative source?
Yes, very good. So we think it makes us a little unique because when we do approach people on Capitol Hill and other people, like, wow, this is actually kind of refreshing to actually have a proposed solution, because normally when you read the papers or the web, there's a lot of people commentating and complaining and not happy with things. But so we kind of tried to take the next step. And one of the key parts of it is to have a philosophical view that says the test for content moderation should not be true or false. The test for content moderation should be, is it harmful or not harmful? And when you make that leap, it actually makes solutions much more workable and much more scalable. You can still deal with safety issues, neutrality issues, all that. But when you look at all these examples, TikTok or COVID or hate speech, all this stuff, if you start focusing on, I'm not trying to decide is it true or false, I'm trying to decide is it harmful or not harmful? Is it imminently harmful to a person or group of persons? Now it turns out there's a vast group of people who are very trained and capable of assessing that, and those are arbitration judges. And there are other entities that use this group, for example, for financial disputes between investors and their wealth advisors. They rely on an organization called FINRA. FINRA is not the government. It's not the industry. It's funded by the industry, but it's this kind of non-government entity that provides independent appeals for investors who feel like they were somehow cheated or lied to or whatever the dispute might be. So we use FINRA as a model. So I spent a fair amount of time talking about FINRA, understanding what they do and the scale of FINRA. And it turns out to be remarkably, something that's remarkably close to what could work in this online media environment.
Is it your understanding that both plaintiffs and defendants, advocacy organizations feel that FINRA is a successful compromise? In other words, they both complain about it. That would probably be the best test.
Yeah. So there are some who complain that FINRA has been captured by the industry, regulatory capture, the way we look at the FDA being captured by pharma, for example. But FINRA hasn't been in the news in terms of like lots of controversy. I think there are complaints on both sides. FINRA's governance is very carefully structured to represent both the industry, but also investors. And so they specifically define how the board of governors of FINRA are selected and what they do, and how the funding works, which is basically a fee charged to the industry based on the size of the company in the industry. and the government has no say in the funding, and the government is not able to hire and fire people at FINRA, and neither is the industry. The industry doesn't get to hire and fire, people at FINRA as well. So it is, FINRA may or may not be perfect, but it is a model for how you could set up something to deal with disputes and appeals between users, content creators, and these platforms.
Well, you're onto something very important, though, which is the very idea of some sort of dispute resolution and transparency is something that's absolutely lacking from the system now. And I have argued that if I were to pass, well, more acutely, I've argued that as a matter of consumer protection, I think that the fact that there's no accountability and that your account can be yanked with no explanation is a deceptive practice. But even if you don't want to agree with me that the FDA Act and the states that FDA acts should prohibit this, or that they certainly would and give the authority to state or local level regulation, if I were to come up with a Bill of Rights for the internet, one of the things that I would really focus on, and in many respects it cures everything else, is what you guys are talking about, which is if someone has a beef, if someone's been burned or believes they have, they don't just get the door slammed in their face. Someone has to explain, someone has to answer. And if you destroyed my business and I can demonstrate that you did so for no good reason, I should have some recourse. But let's not even come up to that, because the vast majority of people just want their accounts back. They just want their accounts back, and there's no, there's this utter lack of accountability. And all of a sudden, it's hilarious how many liberals have become free market advocates. Oh, it's a private company,
Well,
private
that's
companies have been regulated in this country for well over a century in every respect.
Right. Well, there's a legal issue or terminology which you're very familiar with, whether these platforms are common carriers or not. And, you look at the definition of common carriers, for example, Verizon Wireless, they don't get to turn off your service because of something you posted on Facebook, last night, or your electric utility, or airlines. They don't get to pick and choose their customers simply because of no reason at all, or because of something unrelated, And I think the notion that these platforms get to pick and choose the users, and they have their own First Amendment free speech rights as Twitter or as Meta, or they do have First Amendment rights as entities. However, when you become a monopoly and you are now the conduit for our country's, if you will, village square or town square of communications. And as you say, many individuals, many citizens depend on these monopoly platforms to communicate First Amendment rights, or for their business to, be able to express whatever it is they want to express. And those rights start to supersede the private entity rights of these platforms when they become monopolies and effectively common carriers. So part of our proposal is similar to other laws in the past. We say, well, these platforms, they can opt in to the mechanism that we've set up that I was talking about before. And if they opt in, they continue to receive Section 230 liability protections. If they choose not to opt in, they can opt out, but then they will not necessarily get the benefit which has been granted to them by Section 230, the Law of Telecommunications Act of 1996. So there is a mechanism there that says, you don't have to do this, but if you want to continue to moderate in a way without transparency, without safety, without neutrality, and without independent appeals, you're going to lose this, the liability protection, which they very much rely on today.
Are you getting audiences with the management of the major, what are we talking about? Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Everything else is secondary. TikTok is kind of out there. It's a different situation. I don't think censorship is really their problem.
Right. We are meeting with them, I would say, mainly with their public policy type folks, not with the executive. We'd like to get there. And I think partly it's as we get some traction on Capitol Hill, or if there's some traction with this proposal, in terms of public awareness, then I think those audiences will come, because we actually have benefits for those platforms. We actually will reduce their litigation costs, if you think about this, because if people are directed to take their disputes to this arbitration mechanism, which may or may not take their case, if you're absolutely a child pornographer, they may or may not listen to your appeal. But if you have something interesting to appeal, they'll take the case, and then that will happen. But if you're a certified platform, in the same way lots of other industries, people are certified, then basically the arbitration is, did you follow the, your rules that you transparently publish? And it doesn't necessarily lead to lots of litigation. It just leads to in financial incentives to improve your transparency and make sure you follow those guardrails. If you start veering outside the guardrails, yes, you might suffer some penalties, but then you deal with your employees and you solve the problem, and you work within this mechanism.
So going back, though, to the beginning of our conversation, is it possible to get traction on Capitol Hill when pretty much only one side is interested in reform?
It's very difficult. So there is definitely traction on the one side, and interest, and we regularly, about every 3 months, I go back there.
Do you have any allies in the Democratic caucus?
We've talked to a few, but I wouldn't call any of them allies. I think they all keep their head down. It's, you can imagine it saying, yes, this sounds like a good idea, but don't tell anybody that I said so, because they have political considerations. So honestly, my sense is this is all preparing the ground, and potentially after the next election, there might be more possibility for something to happen. Because you also commented about talking to the executive branch. There's not a whole lot of people for us to talk to right now in the executive branch on this, topic, because so many parts of the executive branch have been caught, directly trying to influence content moderation at these companies. So I noticed one of your previous guests, Brendan Carr, is someone that I think is a very interesting person to talk to, and I think his ideas are very consistent with our ideas as well.
Yeah, actually, I should have him back on, because so much has happened since I spoke to him. So much is unbelievable. I wonder whether in terms of that traction, do you ever, in these conversations, even if they're not for public consumption, but don't people on the left realize, especially after Elon Musk took over Twitter, that things could change?
It's so interesting you say that. I kind of knew you were going there. So I just wrote an op-ed that had a title just like that. It said, hey, lovers of censorship, watch out. You really want the son of Donald Trump to be the person deciding content moderation? I mean, things change every 8 years. I mean, historically, we don't have one party control forever. Things just ebb and flow. So when things switch to the other side, do you want the other side to be making, all these strong, influential forces to moderate content in the way that they want?
Remember, though, that a lot of this started, as you pointed out, after the election of Donald Trump. In other words,
that's right.
You can have your president, you can have your House and your Senate, but someone other than elected officials actually implement policy. And
right.
What scares me is that the Democratic side feels that whatever happens in a given election, they ultimately have control over
the deep state.
the organs that you can
Yeah,
call it
yeah.
say,
Well,
the
part of
organs that make things happen. Um, and you can't really argue with that except on mere principle.
mhm.
And you know, if we're talking about power, then mere principle doesn't seem to be an issue.
Yeah, and it's so part of that article was a little tongue in cheek, and I was pointing out examples where the new press secretary was Carrie Lake. And then, exactly what Jen Psaki did. Carrie Lake did the same thing, in 2025. And the new Secretary of Education was one of your previous guests, Christopher Rufo. And now Christopher Rufo is going to be telling Twitter what kind. So it's just to try to get people to think more creatively. The new FBI might be, who knows, Jim Jordan or, but, because somehow got people to think more. It wasn't that long ago, Ron, when it was the liberals who were being censored, right? It was in the 80s, burning flags or Robert Mapplethorpe. I mean, it was totally the other way around, and people just can't
How
remember
about
that stuff.
Tipper Gore,
Yeah.
then wife of Democratic Senator Al Gore, testifying before Congress about the need to censor to some extent music because of the effect it was having on the young folk.
Right, exactly.
So I mean, I do think there is a sense that the worm will never turn on one side, and I think that makes it very difficult to to argue for these things. And I think you have to appeal to a large extent. I think that really the leverage comes from your ability to. I mean, certainly if you get half of the political leadership in the country, that's a hell of a good start. But if you can get buy-in from from a social media company, see, the problem with Google is I don't think Facebook, the way they're burning through money, might be an irrelevant question anyway. But Google has so much money and makes so much money that I don't think they're really incentivized by reducing litigation costs.
Yeah. Well, I think they're incentivized. They're worried about heavy-handed government regulation.
Exactly, I think I think that would be the angle, is to say, listen, we think there's an approach here, because it certainly is possible that a Republican Congress could emerge and a Republican White House could emerge. They could pass something that changes things radically for you guys.
But the other thing that I believe is an even stronger motivator for Google and the others is the threat of antitrust. And you do see these government officials today saying, we'd like you to please ban or censor this content we don't like. Oh, and by the way, we're thinking about antitrust. Did you know that there's a conversation going on it? So it's their way of not coercing, but suggesting with a lot of pressure to please do what we ask.
Which is a matter of constitutional law. If that's a form of coercion that is unlawful, and the question is, how explicit is the threat, and how is it a threat, or is it just, listen, I happen to be on the Commerce Committee. We do it's our bailiwick to talk about antitrust issues. It's also our bailiwick to talk about your industry, and we want to keep it growing and keep American leadership there.
Yeah. So I think the answer to your question is it does look like pessimism is warranted in this sort of bad. But we try to take an optimistic approach. I think if we can get the companies on side, the companies but realizing that this approach is actually beneficial for them, and they don't want to be sitting there arbitering true and false, and they don't want to be waiting for the government to tell them, what to do. They'd like to get out from under that and go focus on their business. So that's one thing. And then I guess the other is, if the executive side changes, maybe there will be some horse trading, process that says we can get this enacted, in the fullness of time. And in the meantime, we just, look, if the censorship advocates kind of get out over their skis, in some ways, I think they have gotten way over their skis with just sending emails saying, please censor this. I mean, it's amazing to me how they didn't even bother to hide it or anything. They just said, we are
And that's an
censoring.
example of the tactical error uh, of despising your adversary, thinking nothing will ever change, and you will always be in charge. But I actually thought when you said that they've gotten out over in front of their skis, that you were going to refer to those two bills, which I think we can end on here. I guess there are more than two bills at this point. The bill that started out being talked about as banning TikTok, which is preposterous. There's no
Oh
constitutional
yeah.
permit for Congress to decide what you can have on your phone. Unless you're in the military, if you work for the government using government phone, fine. But what turns out behind the rest of the nose of that camel is this massive permit that would be given to government bureaucrats to censor, to break into virtual private networks.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. And in fact, I think one good example, any Republicans who are thinking about supporting that Restrict Act, think about News Corp. I mean, it's a foreign company. It's so vague. Like, what does the executive branch gets to decide this is an adversary? Like, how do they decide? There's no, I can easily imagine all sorts of other abuses of that power.
Yeah, I mean, Iran is officially an adversary. Meanwhile, the Biden administration just gave them another X billions of dollars. I mean, is China an ally? Of course not. Is China an adversary? Seems to depend. I mean, right now things with China are kind of rocky, but it's hard to imagine that these bills are intended to address Chinese influence.
It almost seems like these state agencies have figured out, well, we kind of know how to control Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube and Google. These TikTok, this one is a little harder to control. We don't know how to force them to moderate content the way we like. And TikTok, their algorithm is very distinct and different, which you may know, but everyone else does what we call the echo chamber, right? They feed you what you like. Instagram, you start clicking on a certain category of topics, they give you more of it. That's the simplistic, view. TikTok is very different. They just randomly picked some kids dance or some sexy content or some controversial content, trans content, whatever. And then they just decide, let's just blast this out to 50 million people. And it turns out to be very addictive because now all these kids are thinking they're going to win the lottery. They're going to go viral with their little dance or whatever. But it is kind of insidious that they're able to then insert content. So I don't like TikTok. It's like a lot of things. You don't have to like the content, but you have to still say, look, we want information. We have free speech rights. They're an entity, and there are problems specific to TikTok being controlled by the Communist Party of China, which is a little different. Our companies, U.S. companies, do similar things overseas, but it's not the U.S. government. It's these private companies sucking up data and serving up content based on recommendation algorithms. So very similar.
Maybe. Yeah, I'm not so sure.
maybe it's a good point.
Mike, we could go on all day, I think. If people want to find out more about what you guys are doing, how would they do that?
So we have Better Internet or fourbetterinternet.com, the number 4betterinternet.com.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, we just recently changed our name. Actually, it's in an effort to present ourselves as more nonpartisan. We felt First and 14th, which does refer to the amendments, just kind of, if you talk about the Constitution, somehow people think you're a right winger. So I don't know how that happened, but
wow, is that crazy?
It's crazy.
What happened is when the ACLU stopped talking about the Constitution, groups like that stopped talking about the Constitution and started talking about other interests. Betterinternet.us. Okay, and by the time this comes out, we'll be able to throw up on the screen something with the new domain name. Terrific, Mike.
Exactly.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for coming on.
Enjoyed
and
it.
Let's stay in touch.
Right. Thank you. Bye.